The mean arterial pressure. The mean arterial pressure equals cardiac output times peripheral resistance. Okay, the mean arterial pressure is the average blood pressure in the elastic arteries. Why do you want to know what the blood pressure is in elastic arteries? Well, the blood from the left ventricle is going to be pumped into the aorta, and the aorta is the largest of the elastic arteries. The left ventricle has to pump with pressure to open up the semilunar valve for the blood to go into the aorta. So the mean arterial pressure is going to tell you how hard the left ventricle has to contract. Tells you how hard or how forceful the left ventricle contracts. How about this? Tells you how hard or how forceful the left ventricle must contract to open the semilunar valve, to open the aortic semilunar valve. So if your mean arterial pressure is high, that means that the left ventricle is going to have to pump with more contraction or a harder contraction, and it's going to eventually just weaken the heart. Cardiac output. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart every minute. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart each minute. We study cardiac output with our heart chapter, and the heart chapter is what we're on right now. I didn't spell chapter right. Okay, the heart chapter is the chapter we're on right now. So we're going to be looking at cardiac output and how cardiac output can change. And then we'll be looking at peripheral resistance in our blood vessel chapter. Okay, resistance is anything that impedes the flow of blood. So we're going to look at how the blood vessels can impede the flow of blood. Okay, so let's go ahead and erase this so that we'll have room to write down our information on the mean arterial pressure. Okay, cardiac output. Cardiac output equals the heart rate times stroke volume. Okay, stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart per beat. Okay, so cardiac output is going to take into account the amount of blood pumped per minute, but stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart per beat. So let's look at stroke volume. Okay, stroke volume is going to equal what I call it full minus empty. Okay, so let's look at more educated words than full and empty. It's the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. Remember that you have diastolic and systolic. Diastolic means that diastole is going to be whenever the ventricles are relaxed. So at the end of relaxation, the ventricle is going to be full. So we'll draw a big lower heart here. So you have your ventricles opened up and accepting blood. The end systolic volume means that the end of contraction. So we draw our ventricles smaller here or more narrow so that it shows that they're contracted. So let's look at some numbers here for your mean arterial pressure. If you look at mean arterial pressure, your end diastolic volume, you can give it let me change my pen color. let's do red. Okay, we're going to say that whenever the left ventricle is full, it has 125 milliliters of blood. And it's going to contract and it's going to leave 55 milliliters of blood in it. Because the heart's not going to try to squeeze out all of the blood, it's just going to contract, and whatever blood is contracting will leave, and the rest of the blood will just be there for the next contraction. Okay, so 125 minus 55 equals 70 milliliters. 70 milliliters is your stroke volume, so we come up here to our next equation. 70 milliliters for your stroke volume, and we're going to, in this example, say your heart rate is 72. And 72 times 70 is 5,040. So each minute, you would have 5,040 milliliters of blood pumping through your heart. If you remember, the average person has 5 liters of blood in their body. So that is about, that on average, that would mean that every red blood cell goes through your heart once. Okay, cardiac output comes up here to the top. We would say cardiac output equals 5,040 milliliters. And that would be multiplied by the peripheral resistance. I don't know that I've ever seen an actual number for peripheral resistance. It's just going to be talking about how can peripheral resistance be changed and everything. But I do want to look at cardiac output and how it can change. Okay, we're going to say that we're exercising in blue. So exercise is going to have the blue color up in. Whenever you exercise, the heart's going to fill up with more blood. So I'm going to actually increase your ventricle here. And we're going to say that in this example, the end diastolic volume is 155 milliliters. Then the heart's going to contract with a greater force because it filled up with blood. It stretched and held more blood. It recoils with a greater force. That's Starling's law. So you're going to have less blood left in it. So you're going to have about 40 milliliters of blood in the ventricle after contraction. That's going to give you a stroke volume of 115 milliliters of blood. Enter 115 here for our stroke volume. And whenever you exercise, your heart rate goes up. So we're going to give this person a heart rate of 120 beats per minute. And if you multiply 115 by 120, you end up with 13,800 milliliters of blood. So whenever you exercise, you can see that your cardiac output is going to increase. And if your peripheral resistance stayed the same as you exercise, although it doesn't, you can see that if you increase the cardiac output and allowed peripheral resistance to remain the same, then mean arterial pressure would increase.